Okay, welcome everybody to Metal Mastermind. I am Ken Candelas, and I am joined with my co-host, Jason
Jason Stoller.
Stallworth.
What's up, guys? I just knocked my mic when I did my horns. That wasn't supposed to happen, but hey.
That's awesome.
Oh,
What's
dude.
up, buddy? How are you, man?
Good, man. I figured we'd start out today just by telling everybody like something extremely cool that happened to us this week. So I'll let you share first because I'm still trying to think of what cool happened this
Well,
week.
I'll just say this. Right before we just went live, I actually just got a notification on Twitter that Dave Mustaine released his new autobiography today. So that's pretty awesome. It's
That
called
is awesome.
Rust in Peace. It's kind of like the backstory to the song itself and how Dave went about doing all of that. That's really, really interesting. I really want to check that out. And it's got a foreword by Slash. So um, something to check out with this. Well, if Barnes and Noble was your thing, then you can take a visit to that and pick yourself up a copy. But I think they're doing it online now. I don't know if they're really ever. Is Barnes and Noble still around? I forget. Like,
I think they are. I know myself, I like a physical book. I don't read books online because, you and I both, we're in front of the computer, even as
right.
musicians. And, I blog, I'm in front of the computer all the time. So I literally will do most of my reading on my patio. Sometimes I'll be, sitting in the pool and reading there because I don't know. It's almost like, I still get some CDs, but I don't really buy CDs that much, but sometimes I will,
Are
but
you
yeah,
are you
books,
the
I like to have it.
are you the type of person that you like the book because you have like the sort of the smell and the tactile? Is it the sensual experience for you, or is it
I
because you're old school?
Well, probably because I'm old school, because I'm freaking old, dude. I'm like dinosaur over here, but no, there's a lot of reasons why I'd rather have the book. So like you said, the physical, the smell, that's part of it. Uh, there's just something about retaining that information when I have to get the physical book. If I'm reading online, I'm more apt to skim through, and I just don't read online that well. And I know they got these Kindle readers and all that. It just doesn't. I don't know. It's just something, and maybe it's just old school. Maybe you're
I
right
think
about that.
actually you're onto something there because it's screens, they flicker, man. They're literally
Yeah,
like
dude. Yeah,
shining light into your eyes. So
yeah.
our eyes are not really supposed to take in that kind of light all the time. It's like you don't look straight at the sun all day.
Yeah,
So
exactly, dude.
I
Yeah.
think
So I
I
don't
think
know.
uh,
The
I think
book
it
is the
says something when you're actually reading a paper. It's easy on the eyes if you have decent lighting to light up the page. It's totally true. Um, and now that we're talking about books, I mean, one of my favorite books that I think probably one of the last books I read was probably The Hobbit. That was a
okay.
long time ago. J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, dude. That's got to be a pretty
Yeah.
intense book, dude. Those things are big.
Yeah, those were thick cut books, like thick slices of bacon there for you. But it's just
Yeah.
you're reading that thing and you're just like, oh my god. I mean, there is a sort of like adventure to reading a book. I really do love that. When I was a kid, my mom, she was like so big into like Harry Potter, more so than even I was as a kid. She was like a fanatic about Harry Potter. I think when the first movie came
Ooh,
out, since my brother
yeah.
was working at the theater, we would always get like free passes. So we went to
Yeah.
go and see Harry Potter. I think it was like literally 7 times. The first
Dude.
movie, Sorcerer's Stone,
Yeah.
and my mother could not get enough of it. Oh my god. But I was all excited about it too. And ever since then, it was just like I read almost all the Harry Potter books. I think the last one was the
Wow,
one I
dude.
didn't fully read. I went like halfway through it, and then I was just like, I'm just gonna watch the movie because they made two movies on this.
Yeah. Well, those are scary movies, dude. I thought those last two Harry Potter movies, something about Hollow, something, I don't remember the name of them,
Yeah,
but dude, those
Deathly
were actually
Hollows, I think.
borderline scary.
Yeah, there's some creepy factor to the Harry Potter story. There's not. It's not all wonderful wizards of Oz. It's also the dark side of what magic it can provoke too. Um,
Yeah.
But
It's
anyway,
crazy.
right? We're not here to talk about magic or books. We're just kind of setting the stage here,
Yeah.
guys. We're gonna talk about what today? What are we talking about today, Jason?
Dude, it's all like any guitar player's favorite topic. I was calling this when I was posting on Facebook, I was calling it tone talk, and I sent
Tone
an email to our
talk.
subscribers.
Tone
Yeah, it's
talk,
also, we
man.
want to talk to you guys about a very subjective topic as well. So we're going to cover some basics here, but we're going to dig into some deeper stuff as well. But
Are
all
you
about guitar and bass tone in the mix, though, the recorded tone in the mix.
do you consider yourself a tone head?
I don't. No, the thing is, I started out when I was messing around with tones, my first album. I kind of got really frustrated just going back and forth. And what I find a lot of times, what I've found over the years is that it almost doesn't really matter which of the 10 tones I was struggling with I would have used, because when you put everything in the mix, it just has its own life. And I don't want to use that as an excuse to be lazy and not search for tone, a good tone. I think there's a nice balance between that and obsessing over tone, because when you obsess over anything, what happens is you don't really take any action. You're just like, well, we got to find that perfect tone. And then tomorrow you wake up after finding the
Guilty.
perfect tone and it's like, where did it go? Where's my tone? And now you're on, it's
Oh
never
gosh.
ending. So I accept the fact that it's never ending search. But like each album, you're never going to find the perfect tone, because each album I put out, I want a slightly different guitar tone. And I just want something that sounds good and fits the song rather than a good guitar tone, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've been in studio sessions where we literally spent 6 hours just trying to find the right tone. Yeah, talk
Yeah.
about overkill. Like,
Yeah.
move on, bro. There was oh my god, it was like
Yeah.
one of my earlier projects where I was like a newbie at all this kind of stuff, so it was hard for me to like get that. And also I was just using the wrong amplifier for what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
I think it was an Egnator amplifier, and it was
Egnator. Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
Egnator, pretty decent guitar amp by all means, and it was an emulating sort of thing. So they had like different. It was a switch where you can try a British style, American Vox, or something like that. And
Yeah.
is Vox even American? But then you had I think I meant Fender. So then you had this sort of like balance where you could like fiddle around with it, but like what I was trying to do, and I was trying to do like some metal, and it was just like, man, like I went for the British, and it just it didn't do it the right way. Like it was
Yeah.
like one single woofer type of guitar amp. It didn't have a lot of wattage.
Hmm.
Like I needed a freaking Marshall stack. What I wanted, you just
Yeah.
got to get the right amplifier. By the way, guys, if you go to our video on the
Ooh,
golden rules
yes.
of recording, okay, number 2, the proper instrument. Also,
Yeah.
the right amplifier if you're a
Yeah.
guitarist,
We got to put
okay?
that in
The
there.
right
Yeah.
guitar and the right
Yeah.
amp, man, makes a huge difference. So, yeah, man. Yeah, I've been there. It's
It,
troubling.
but it's funny you mentioned that. So, one of the what I consider one of the kings of tones is Killswitch Engage. I mean, when I first heard them, I'm like, whoa, this is an awesome guitar tone. And it's kind of like a famous IPA beer here in Tampa called Highlight by Cigar City. Once they came out with that, like everybody was measuring their IPAs by that around here. Killswitch Engage, same thing with tone. But here's the thing, though. I feel like when you're searching for tone, you usually have a sound in mind that sounds like someone else already because it's influenced,
Mm.
and you're searching for that tone. And
Mhm.
people get pissed off, like, well, I'm trying to get this kill switch tone and it's just not working. It's like, look, dude, there are so many other factors involved. It's not just plugging your guitar into that one amp and boom, there's your tone. There are so many
Right.
factors involved in the mixing and the processing, the post processing, the mastering, all that stuff. So it's I kind of don't I want a good tone, yes, but I kind of don't obsess over it anymore, because again, it holds up productivity. And number 2 is there's a lot of really great albums that I like, that don't necessarily have the best guitar tone in my opinion. Like In Flames is one of them. Their guitar tone, probably on its own doesn't really sound that great, but it fits their music. Another
Yeah.
band, Before the Dawn, they were another band. They actually had one album, I can't remember the name of it, but it was very poorly produced. But there's this one song, Burning Cradle or something, I can't remember the name of it. Just amazing song. It's like their guitar tone kind of sucked, the production sucked, but it's like, I like this song. I'd listen to it all day. I don't care about the other stuff, you know? So there's a balance to where you get into like, okay, you can have a great tone, the perfect tone, but if your songwriting skills aren't up to speed, it's just going to be like, okay, well, that sounds good for the first 10 seconds, but I'm bored now. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
well, is there ever such a thing as a perfect tone, right? I mean, it's
No,
like
I don't think so. I really
it's
don't think
like
so. I think,
so like it's gonna be perfect for one person, but it not for another, you know? So
but I don't want to use that as an no, because this is the other side of it. Then this is kind of our side of it, what we're teaching and everything, and what we're putting out there. I don't want to use that as an excuse for people to be lazy. It's like, oh, screw it, I'm just going to plug in and play. I don't care about tone. That's not what I'm saying either. I'm saying there's got to be like, I don't want people to take us the wrong way. There's got to be a balance though between the two, between like, and I heard a really famous startup company. I can't remember what it was, so maybe they're not so famous, but a strong startup company said that, you have to get to the point where good enough is perfection. Otherwise, you won't move the needle forward. You will never put it out. You'll end
yeah.
up, like you said, spending 6 hours on fighting for a tone
Exactly.
when you
Yeah,
could have
yeah.
been spending 6 hours something else.
Exactly. Perfectionism is like such
Yeah.
a detriment. And like people always think that perfectionist mindset is like, oh, well, it's going to be perfect. It's going to be awesome, but it actually there's a
Right.
big hindrance to doing that because there's never anything as perfect.
That is
Nothing's
true.
ever perfect. So,
So true, dude.
yeah, that definitely gets in the way. So whenever somebody tells me I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I'm like, yeah, okay, you hold yourself back. So,
Yeah, or you make an excuse not to move forward because if
yeah,
you, before we dig into this,
definitely.
but, when you're a perfectionist, quote unquote, and you're searching for that perfect tone, that's really your comfort zone and not going beyond that. It's
Right.
like, well, I can't release that song because I just don't have the right gear, I don't have the right tools, or I just can't get the tone. So I'm gonna work on this tone some more for another 6 months, and you just never
Right.
you never move forward and progress. And I think that perfectionism is just a nice way to stay in that comfortable little position to where you don't have to venture out and do something that you're afraid of.
I also
That's
think,
just
yeah, no, it's totally true, and I think there's another aspect to that is that by searching for your perfect tone, you kind of put yourself in this bubble where you don't actually think about how the tone applies to what you're doing.
that's a good point,
So
dude.
I think an easier way to go about going over that hump that people
Yeah.
get is functionality of the tone that you're achieving for where it's going to be placed. That's one of the many reasons why I love reamping guitars rather than just straight up recording the guitars with the amplifier and on the first go. Most of the time in my recording sessions, right, so guys, by the way, we're talking about, Jason's a guitarist. I'm an engineer. I am not a guitarist by any means, but I've worked with a ton of guitars. And what we do in the studio many times is we'll record the guitar with a DI or direct
Mhm.
injection box, which will basically take just the dry signal of the guitar without it being amped at all. We'll record that, and at the same time, that person will be routing their signal, their guitar signal, over to the amplifier. So we'll record that too, and it'll be recorded simultaneously so that during the session the guitarist is feeling comfortable. He's loving himself. He's just like, man, it sounds so good, man. It sounds so good. and then afterwards, you're just like, yeah, that tone sucks, bro. Like, and then what you do is you kind of mute the guitar track and you get the actual tone another day, and you send it to the guitarist, which you never tell him you did that. You just like you
Right,
present
dude.
it
Yeah.
to them and you say, check out the
That's
new
your amp.
mix, man. And he's just like, dude, my tone is amazing. Isn't that tone the best? You're
Yeah.
just like, yeah, bro, it's the best.
Yeah, it's great.
So
So let's jump into the guitar in the mix, man. We're right there at it. And Faceless just mentioned this as well. And this is like our first point is and to kind of piggyback off what you just said, Ken, is your recorded tone is going to be different from your bedroom tone or your practice tone rather. And a lot of people will they'll come up with this great tone that sounds awesome in the bedroom, but then that same tone's probably not going to work in the mix. So, dude, what's your perspective from an engineering perspective of that? Why do those tones need to be different, and what are some of the things that we need to do to get a good tone
Well,
for the mix?
when you're in your bedroom, it's a little bit different because the purpose of having an amplifier played in the bedroom is mostly for like practice purposes. And
Yeah.
for that, you know, have at it, do what you will, emulate whoever you want. You can get sort of close, but you know, because sound is not, linear. It changes exponentially wherever it goes. Um, Once you bring that same amplifier into a studio, it might sound like it's going to sound totally different. It might sound really small in comparison to those big 4x4 cabs. And of course, because it's
Yeah.
maybe not pushing as much air. I mean, unless you're bringing a 4x4 cab into the studio. So it's just because of the environment, it's going to change it, which is also another golden rule, by the way. That's number 3. It's your environment heavily affects your tone. It's very popular for engineers to want to record up close and also have a microphone in addition to that, maybe about like 6 feet away from the cabinet to capture more of the ambience of what it's doing in the room too. Very popular techniques, and they use it all the time, especially for like Van Halen. They were doing that all the time. So that's where you get that big sort of sound
You
of
can
the
hear
of
that,
the
yeah,
guitar. Yeah, you get this
especially,
giant
yeah.
sort of sound because you're recording the room along with the up close direct on that amplifier. So when it comes to like practice, just kind of enjoy it for what it is. Mostly this is an opportunity for you to learn the parameters of your amplifier, and I would take into account how much let's say an amplifier will distort the signal versus how much saturation happens on the output of it, versus the tone knobs, presence, treble,
Yeah.
mids, and bass. Learn what those are doing, how are they affecting the signal, and then when you go to the studio, you're a little bit more educated so that you can, execute faster than let's say, you don't want to necessarily think that the tone that you got in your bedroom is the tone because it sounds
Right.
good in your bedroom, but it's not going to sound the same when you go somewhere else.
Yeah.
You know.
And that kind of brings us to the next point. Kind of from a guitarist perspective is, you know, bro, I want more gain. Gain is like gain is like this obsession with the guitar players. And I get it. Like I love that chunky gain. You can get those squeals and all that good stuff. But from a guitarist perspective, I want to talk about why too much gain doesn't really work well in the mix. And of course, the guitarist perspective is I want more gain, but what I've found personally as a guitarist and mixing my own albums is that the gain has to be cut down in order to sit in the mix because otherwise you will have a very potentially muddy mix and it's going to
Yep.
be competing, which we'll talk about frequencies and EQ in a little bit here as well. But dude, so what's your perspective as an engineer
So
on
that's
gain?
a great point. There's a thing called the acoustic envelope. It's called
Okay.
ADSR, which is attack, decay, sustain, and release. Whenever
Okay.
you increase the gain on something, you're obviously making it louder. Now, it may not sound louder on a guitar amp when you increase the gain necessarily. There's like a sort of limit, but that's because there's 2 different stages of gain. So you have the first stage, which is the preamp stage, and then you actually have the amplifier stage, where the preamp boosts the signal itself into the amplifier stage, where the amplifier is the actual volume. That's why there's a master volume, and that's why there's an overdrive or preamp volume, right? And the preamp, when you crank that all the way, it sounds more distorted, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily go louder on the amplifier end.
Yeah.
Now, when you're working with that preamp, you have to keep in mind that by raising the volume of the guitar, you're raising everything, right? It's not just the signal of the guitar, it's everything. It's all the electronics that go into it too. And by doing that, this sort of acoustic envelope, you're picking up all the quiet parts to it. So now the sustain lasts a lot longer. So whenever you hold down a guitar note, that sustain, like, especially up all the way at 11, lasts for like ever, right? You could be like, you know, it'll just
And it
stay
keeps
there,
going.
and you have to sort of implement, you know, palm muting in order to control that. But even then, your guitar is way more prone to feedback because you gained everything so high that now whenever you like let go of the strings, you hear that, you know. So everything is so much more sensitive, is what I'm saying, right? So having more gain, there's a certain part where there's not enough return on your investment. It's just it just adds more noise. It just adds more noise at a certain point, and it's not doing anything for you but adding more noise. This is one of the reasons why I actually cannot stand Mesa Boogie triple rectifiers, because you got 3 stages of overdrive, and I'm just like, are you kidding? Like who needs 3 stages of overdrive? Like, give me a dual rectifier and I'm good. But triples are just like the whole fucking time. So I can't really stand triples too much. They're really hard to work with, and everything else, yeah, like you said, it gets muddied. You have to like carve it out a lot in the mix, and before you know it, you're just ending up with the high screeching parts of it. Yeah, not my favorite route to go.
No, I totally get that, and that kind of brings us to the next point, man. We talked about gain, and now we want to talk about a little bit about the amp EQ and presence. I know another gripe with the guitar players when they're recording is like, well, my guitar sounds thin; it doesn't have a lot of bottom end. And one of the things I learned in recording was that you kind of have to back off the bass because you don't want too much bottom end. When you're playing in your bedroom and practicing, you want the bottom end because you don't have drums and bass guitar, and you're used to hearing that in your
Yes.
music. You're like, I want that thump. But when you're recording, you've got to leave room for those lower frequencies to be carried through in the kick drum and the bass guitar. If your guitar is competing with that because you've got your bass turned up too much, those frequencies are going to be competing, and there we have a muddy mix, just like having too much gain. So, dude, what's some of your engineering perspectives on
That's
that?
I mean, you hit it right on the nail, man. It's just you can't like, you're not the it's an ego thing, I think, really.
I
It's
think
like
it is, dude. Yeah.
you can't you're not everything, man. You can't play the
Yeah.
bass, you can't play the drums and everything together, right? So
Yeah.
I think people who haven't really played that much in a band setting, it's harder for them to grasp that because they're not used to it, and that's just an inexperienced thing. But people that have definitely played in bands, they've probably gotten into arguments with their bass player. It's like, dude, like maybe the bass player didn't even know. There's some instances of that too, where it's just like the bass player's just like, I just play bass, bro. I don't even know. Then
If the bass player sucked, maybe the guitar player's got to make up for that somehow.
yeah. So, but the guitarist, it's actually, if you ever look at a like a frequency chart on how it's mixed in an actual song, you'll find that, man, like all that high end, that's cut. All that low end, that's cut. And what you're getting is really just like this mid range, anywhere between, I want to say, like 200 hertz to just about like 6 to 7K. Nothing really above that, right? Because the moment you get to like 5K, like that's where you're getting into like all this like edginess, and and below that is like crunch. But beyond that, it's just like, it's just this like fizz that
It's like a fart almost,
yeah, it's just like this high fizz that doesn't really do anything for you, So all of that other stuff is below. It's actually mostly mid-range information, and that's where the guitar really does shine. Of course, that's also a part where you have to kind of think about how it affects vocals, because vocals are also very mid-range. So guitars, they have like this. It is a wide bandwidth in all senses, but it when applied in the mix, you're not really using all of that information. You're leaving that bass information for the bass to take over, and even the
Right.
bass, in comparison to like drums, right? Like the drums, like whenever I'm tuning drums, like it's to a bass. Like I want to make sure that the drums are not clamoring with bass frequencies, because then you'll hear like this sort of flubbing that's kind of happening between the two, and that's always like annoying to hear too. So maybe that's just being me as a mix engineer and trying to always like balance things around. But you always kind of give each instrument a sort of pocket of where to sit, so that nothing's really stepping on each other. They're kind of working in harmony with each other.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's just reiterate the point. That's why your bedroom tone that sounds so great when you're practicing. It's probably gonna be the tone you use in recording. And as a guitar player, and you hit it with the ego thing a minute ago, because a lot of guitar players do have egos. Metal is kind of primarily guitar driven, so it's like, well, gotta hear my guitar, bro. But like you said, when you've got clashing frequencies, then the mix overall is not going to sound good. If your guitar sounds awesome to you, but everything else is muddy and you can't hear the bass and the drums are crappy or whatever, it's not going to be a good song. And it's not going to be a good experience for the listener.
Right.
But dude, let's talk about bass frequencies, man, because this is I think is a topic, your bass guitar. I think this is a topic that most people just kind of ignore because it's like, okay, well, it's just bass guitar. We want to hear the guitar. So the first thing we had is bass in the mix. One thing I want to bring up is, and I learned this from a sound man, a live sound guy I used to play under a long, long time ago. Is like bass is more of a feeling than it is a sound.
Yeah.
It's more of a movement. So I know from a bassist perspective, a lot of times he's like, dude, I can't hear my bass. And of course, that's because a guitar player is too loud or their bass is cut too high. But you also don't want the bass drowning out everything else. So I think that comes back to proper EQ. But what are some takeaways for bass in the mix,
That's a
Ken?
that's a tricky one, because like bass is there's a fine line with bass, and one of the trickiest parts of it is how does it mesh with the rhythm section,
Okay.
because you have these frequencies, sub frequencies, to be quite more like precise about it. Sub frequencies have a lot of energy, right? You can feel it rocking the house when you play things too
Yeah,
loud,
dude.
right? So sub frequencies have a lot of energy, but sub frequencies are very loose. There's just no way to, get around it. They're just really big giant waves, and they go everywhere and you can't control them. They're basically like the big giant foot like slamming down. So it's when you're working with bass and drums, those two can clash real quick,
Mm,
because something's got to be holding that sort of energy. No one can be. It's like it's like you play Mario Kart, right? There's only one person who can be gold, right? And that's the same thing here. It's either, are you going to make the drums the priority, or are you going to make the bass the priority? It's not uncommon to have bass and metal actually be the thing that carries everything. Drums, people kind of get carried away with it, but like earlier, if you listen to a King Diamond record, like drums were not the things that were holding it down. It was actually the bass. The
no,
drums were
yeah,
very much more like they were mixed with a shaving on the bottom end.
yeah.
So I think this pertains even more so to live, because on the stage, it's super important for the bassist to be able to feel all the rumble coming from their cabinet. And it's really hard for them to play with in-ears just on its own. Um, I don't know how many of you out there, maybe probably most of you, that you're playing, when if you're playing bass, you're usually playing it just like a DI straight into your interface. And
Yeah, it's true.
that is a very like common recording technique for the simple fact that it's so much cleaner. Like there's not a lot of low frequency information that, I mean, like you still get low frequency information, don't get me wrong, for sure, but it's cleaner low frequency information because it's
You have to
straight
fight
from the
with it.
string. It's not in the environment that's canceling itself out and all this type
Yeah.
of acoustic crap. So it's a lot easier to work with in the mix. It's a lot cleaner. That's why they use it. And when you're like live, it's like it's hard to mix the two. Like you want to have a big sounding drum kit, but the bass is so all encompassing. You got to pick one or the other as a bandmate, right? You got to have that discussion. Like sometimes, if the bassist is like in the music really holding it down that way, and they got like a lot of just long held notes to sort of emphasize the low end, maybe the drums need to be tuned just a little higher,
Mm.
just to not clash with that. You can't have a 26-inch bass drum and then also have a freaking giant like bottom end from the bass. It's just going to sound like, it's just not going to work out so well. So yeah, it's a tricky thing, man. Like I mean, like mixing the. I always find that you know, it's kind of a backwards way of thinking about it. But when you're mixing just the mid range, you actually tend to find that the low end works out. It's a weird thing because it's most of the things that we're actually paying attention to. This is a phenomenon called the critical range, where we are basically listening mostly to mid frequencies, and the clarity of a mix comes from the mids in our song. Um, so if we get our mids right, chances are that the other stuff falls into place with that. Um, and it's just kind of phenomenal to kind of see stuff like that happen. I'm always amazed every time whenever I work on a mix, and it becomes so much cleaner because of working in that method. That's why you always see like these smaller speakers in studios that they're like kind of crappy looking, because those are actually really critical. They listen to basically just the mid range on those, and if it sounds really good, that's why NS10s in studios all across the world were such a big popular thing, because they were workhorses for the mid range. And if you got the mid range
Yeah.
right, it
That
sounded
funk.
good everywhere else, right? So, really interesting at how that happens.
Now, here's the ultimate question for for bass. Why is there no love for the bass a lot of times in metal music? Some bands are good at this, like Megadeth. I give them props because Dave Ellefson, he's always been good at, and his bass wasn't really didn't have a lot of low end. He had more mid range in his bass, so it made it to where you could hear the bass, but it was still carrying low enough end to carry that part of it. But then, of course, the famous and Justice for All album, Metallica's Justice for All, where Lars just purposely cut Newsted's bass out. But I mean, really, just listening to metal in general, sometimes bass is kind of like you can tell it was just an afterthought, if even. So,
Sure.
what do you think happens? What do you think's going through the mind and of the mixing, the producers when they're doing these?
Well, you know what, man? I also want to point out, like Maiden, all their songs were
Yeah.
written by the bass player. You
Oh
know,
wow,
for
I didn't know this, dude. I just learned
Maiden,
something new.
yeah, most of their songs, like I want to say, like 80 to 90% of the songs were written by the bass player.
Yeah.
He's really, and if you ever listen to a Maiden song, right, there is actually a more prominent bass line for that, and it's kind of funny you say that, because some people definitely don't prioritize it as they should. Um,
Yeah.
I think it ultimately depends on who's in charge. You know,
Mm.
I always find melodic bass lines to be way more interesting to carry a song forward, but some people don't really think of it that way. Some people think
Yeah.
that it's really more on the guitars. Um, I mean, like Nile is like a really good example of just like
Yeah.
bass is just doing this.
Yeah.
There's not really much going
Yeah.
on down there, but in a band like Nile, not much really can go much down there because
Yeah, that's what the music calls
bass.
for.
Yeah, playing bass fast, like that is prime time for muddiness. So chance
Dude,
chances are
yes,
it's
yeah.
like in a band like that, the bass just kind of holds fundamental notes, and the rest is the guitars that take the lead on all that stuff, which is totally fine. It just serves more to fit the role of the foundation, and that's bass is very much that's what its calling is. It's to be part of the foundation. It's a subjective thing, man. I think some people prefer to have more interesting bass lines and they take more priority for that. Other people decide that it's not as important to them. They have their own reasons for it, but um, I think it doesn't take away from how important it is, though, right? I think bass players, like, I have a funny story because it's I mean, my father, he was a musician, playing for like over 30 years as well. And
Oh, yeah.
he went to a friend of his house and he was just like, he's got this new record and it's all exciting and stuff like that. And my dad's just like, he's listening to the record and he's like, where's the bass? And the
Oh
guy is
no,
just
dude.
like,
What do you mean?
oh, right. I'm like,
Oh, dude.
what? Like, you didn't even put bass in your own record. I mean, the guy was a guitarist, so he was just thinking about guitar and maybe some drums, but no bass.
Oh
So
man.
funny, so
And it
funny.
was already done. Like
It
it
was
was this is
done. It was mastered and everything.
Jesus, dude.
So
Oh
you
wow.
kind of think of that. You're just like, wow, man. I don't
There-
even know
There's
what to
something I
say.
want to say about bass though, dude. This because I'm like you, I like to hear some bass runs and stuff like that, and even some bass solos. But again, like you said, like bands like Nile, there's not a lot of room for that.
Yeah.
One thing I do when I'm mixing though, when I'm doing my own mixes, I will, as I'm listening to the song, I will actually mute the bass and then I'll unmute it and I'll analyze what difference is there.
That's a great
And
technique.
if
Yeah.
I don't really hear much of a difference, then I know I need to either turn something up or change the frequencies of that bass guitar. You know what I mean? So
Mm.
I need to be, and even if the song or the part of the song, the bass isn't supposed to dominate, that's fine. But I should be able to tell it's missing if I mute that channel. And if I can't tell that it's missing, then I'm doing something wrong as a mixer, you know?
Yeah, I think anywhere between the second harmonic or the second overtones, I'm sorry, second octaves range or third octave range on a bass is like prime time for getting in those note details because
Yes, dude, yes.
because the fundamentals itself, that's like sub, that's like really hard to work with, but they
Yeah.
carry a lot of weight. That's the benefit of the fundamental, carry a lot of weight. But the second and third octaves, they have just a little bit more clarity to the actual note itself, and that's where I try to kind of like boost that, and I keep the sub information mostly in the kick drum range. So you'll
Okay,
have,
that makes sense.
yeah, you have that first octave just like kick. Second and third octave is bass. Then you get to third and fourth, fourth and fifth, and stuff beyond that. That's like guitars.
Yeah.
Guitars. That's where they kind of like start to have more of presence and shine in there. Not really presence. Presence is its own frequency range. That's kind of around 6K, but like
Yeah.
around, I would say 300, 400, 500 hertz. That's where you start to get like guitars to have a good body, right? That's where their body really does lie. Um, and if it goes down low enough and it's appropriate, you can get down to 300. No problem.
Yeah.
You just gotta watch out for the woofiness of the guitar because the woofiness does interfere with the rhythm
It'll
section
compete. Yeah.
because you have this right, this sort of air that just conflicts. It's kind of weird. It's a physics thing.
Now I will bring up two kind of tips for both bass players and guitar players, or just really as a band in general. Uh, for bass, there's two things. One is the bass doesn't have to play the exact same thing the guitar is playing 100% of the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes if the guitar is doing some really fast stuff, moving around a lot, like you mentioned earlier, Ken, if the bass is trying to do the same thing, yeah, that's a recipe for disaster and mud. So maybe in some of those parts, it doesn't mean they have to play something different. That's not what I'm saying, but there are times where the bass maybe should have the notes ring out a little bit or just do something a little different, and let the guitar do that thing. And then when guitars go off on these wild and crazy riffs, that's another time maybe the bass should lay back a little bit. On the other hand, if there's a part of the song where maybe the guitar is not doing so much and there's just some power chords ringing out, then the bass can kind of like carry a melody in that part of the
Right.
song. The second thing I want to mention about bass is in between sections of the songs, like in between verse chorus or chorus to bridge, that's a good time to throw in those little bass runs. Or if you have a longer verse in the middle of that verse, for example, might be a little bass run just to kind of change things up, keep the listener enticed, so the song doesn't just sound like the same thing over and over again. So that's just 2 points I want to make with bass. It's just something I try to do in my own music. And hey, third tip, bonus tip, there's no harm in throwing a little bass solo. Let your bass player have a little solo maybe in one or two songs
I
or
love
something like
those.
that. Make them feel good, make them feel important.
Actually, I want to highlight on these comments here because I think, Faceless, you made a really, really great question, which is, how about a band with two 8-string guitarists? What about that? Right? I think this kind of gets into the realm of like gent, and that kind of style of metal. What are your thoughts on 8-string guitars, Jay?
So here's my thing. If you're using an 8-string guitar or you're down tuning a 7-string guitar, that guitar really should not have a lot of low end because it's naturally going to have low end, right? So you got to think as a guitarist, lower notes does not necessarily mean heavy. So yeah, you are getting more into that gent, but if you had a bass guitar, you do need a bass guitar. I would EQ the bass a little differently to maybe carry a little bit more mid range, so you kind of hear that, kind of like a Dave Ellefson EQ style, even though it's a different style of music. Uh, I would EQ it that way so you can hear that mid range a little more, and
Mm.
maybe reduce the bottom end on the bass. But I still think you would need a bass. I mean, two 8-string guitarists, the guitars are not going to compensate for the bass, and if you try to make them compensate for the bass, it's just not going to work. It's going to sound like mud,
It's gonna just
because
sound like an 8-string guitar.
yeah, exactly. It's just gonna sound like an 8-string guitar, and I get where you're going with this. I get it because it's a low note. You think, well, I don't need the low end, but there's a different frequency as a guitar string, even an 8-string that could. I don't even know what that'd be tuned to,
Well, it's
but
also just
that
like
string,
physically different strings.
yeah, it's way different,
Yeah,
completely different.
you got
So you
really
still need that
thick.
bass carrying the bottom end.
Yeah, you still really got that thick strings
Yeah,
coming off the bass. They may be tuned the same, but the timbre of the strings are going to be totally different.
yeah,
And I just want to point out that the mid range that you were mentioning about, like a lot of that string action on a
yeah,
bass really comes through in around like that 1 to 2K area. Really, really critical range for having that definition of string action. So if you really want to get that, like blah 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 blah, kind of slappy sort of
yeah, dude.
vibe coming in on the bass, that's where you'll find it. And guitars, they don't really get that. They're not,
No,
it's all like picking and hard picking
yeah.
and stuff
They're
like
not
that.
designed to get that.
They're not,
You know.
yeah, you're not going to get that same timbre. So
Yeah.
you're really right on saying, highlighting that sort of mid-range area of the bass, because then you actually do hear a lot more of that striking of the strings sort of sound that helps
Yeah.
to give it that characteristic. Um, yeah, and when working with tones on bass and guitar, right? And something I also want to also highlight, and I really want to get your views on this, which is when you're putting tone onto an amplifier, how does it differ from rhythm guitars to lead solo guitars, right? What is your method on how are you approaching that?
That's a really good question, dude, because what I do, like I like to cut. I'm old school when it comes to my metal tones. I know a lot of modern guitar players want more mid range in their guitars, but in the rhythms, I still cut my mids down to about four, not drastically, but um, and whereas you've got your low end kind of cut back a little bit to about 4.5, give or take, right? So it can sit well in the mix. And with the mids and the bass being cut a little bit on my rhythms, I'm going to add those to my leads because I'm not playing those lower strings. Sometimes I might, but primarily you're going to be playing the higher notes on a lead, right? So for that, I'm actually going to boost the bass a little bit to give it more punch. I'm also going to increase both the mid and the treble. Now, let me go back a minute. My EQ is nothing crazy, and I know
Mm-hmm.
my audience on my YouTube channel has seen my EQ countless times. I always start with everything up the middle, and I make subtle adjustments. The only thing that's past like 6.5 might be the treble in some cases. Presence is usually like between 4 and 6, depending on what amp I'm using. So I will boost my leads. I'll boost the gain because I want that sustain. I'll boost the bass a little bit. I'll boost the mids to about 6, and usually the treble I don't really have to touch that. So it's just boosting the gain, boosting the bass and the mids a little bit to give it more of that sitting well in the mix. Now another thing I'll do with leads is I'll make sure the mic is a little, if I'm micing an amp, that'll be a little bit closer or maybe right on the center of the cone because that's going to help it cut through the mix a little better. Because oftentimes your lead, if you don't do those things, your lead's going to be competing with the other guitars, especially if you're using the same amp. So that's my method anyway. That's been kind of what works for me for cutting through that
So
mix.
when you like increase the bass on the bass knob on a guitar lead, is that because it gives the notes more weight
It does.
on your runs and stuff like that? Is that why you're doing that?
Exactly. It's especially if you're playing fast, especially if you're doing some
Right.
faster stuff. The problem if you leave the bass cut on a lead, it's going to sound very thin.
Right.
It's going to sound really thin, especially with the gain boosted on it as well. It's just going to be more saturation, but without that bottom end. And the
Yeah.
bottom end on your lead guitar is not going to compete with anything else. It's just going to give that note a little bit more punch and a little bit more clarity. So that's why now I don't boost it substantially. Like we're talking about, rhythms are at like 4.5. My leads might be at 5.5,
Right.
maybe 6, depending on the amp or what the lead's doing. So that's just been my thing. But yeah, those three things are all I boost. And I don't make, again, my adjustments aren't anything crazy. They're just very subtle shifts.
Yeah.
I've never been one to do I've seen people do crazy EQs, and it's just like, that's just never worked for me. If it works for them, that's fine. But
You know,
it's never worked.
I wanna take that into another situation, which is
Yeah.
it's actually very easy to have just a little bit give a big difference.
Yeah. It
Guys,
is.
just as a like a fun tip, you can say this at your cocktail parties and be like, "Did you know that you only need about 3 decibels to hear a real change without
Mm.
even expecting it, right? If you're expecting it, 1 decibel is
Wow, dude.
a noticeable change." And just to put that into perspective, okay, it's like me going from this volume that I'm speaking now to this volume, check, 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 that is about a 10 decibel difference,
Yeah.
right? So you're getting a very, very minute like change here, but it's enough to hear that
Yeah.
like sort of guitar come through. That's the goal, right? It's not necessarily to just give so much bottom end. It's just to bring it out just a little more,
Yeah.
give a little more
Just a
weight to
touch.
that solo so it has a bigger presence. Now, speaking of presence, what is the difference between presence and treble? That's like a big thing that it's like, well, don't they kind of do the same thing? And it's like, well, not exactly. So, what's your experience when using presence and treble? When have you decided to use one over the other?
The funny thing is on every amp or plugin I've ever used, my treble's always been about the same. What changes is the presence depending on that amp. So if I'm, and let's go to amp sims, for example, because we've all played with tons of amp sims. So if it's something like a Marshall amp sim, I'm going to have the presence, cut down to about 4. If it's, let's say, I think a Mesa amp sim, I'll cut the presence up to about 6. Now, again, nothing's ever crazy. Now I'm looking at my EVH right now. My presence is, yeah, it's right at 4 for the EVH amp. I don't like to cut it too much, but I don't want to boost it too much. If you boost presence too much, treble gives you high end. Too much presence will give you fizz, if that makes sense. So it's kind of the difference I see. But again, nothing crazy there. But it depends. It depends on the amp. It's either 4 or 6. To be on the give you a straight answer and be on the safe side, it's either a 4 or 6. And I guess that just depends on how the amp is designed, the circuitry, and all that. What tone that amp gives you.
Right.
Sometimes the amps need a little bit. Sometimes the amps need it cut to give me the tone that I want. And honestly, I don't even change the presence really from rhythm to lead. It is solely based on that amp. That presence kind of stays across the board depending on what amp I'm playing through.
Yeah, and there's actually a more scientific reason behind presence too, which is basically it's a saturation of a certain frequency range that gives it more edge. It's definitely like part of EQ. You see the presence range being somewhere around that 5 to 6K. I think it's actually more like 6K. That range, which is in the same range of like edginess and harshness and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But above that, all you're really boosting is like what we call air, or this like sheen, this sort of thing that's like above everything. You don't really
Yeah.
have too much in that range. But presence is a really unique thing because that's the difference between something feeling really crunchy or
Yeah.
feeling really, really harsh. And you have to kind of fiddle that. I would say presence gives more of a difference to the tone than treble could do. Treble is just basically boosting or cutting high end, and that has an effect on the tone for sure, but it's not as dynamic as presence. Presence has a little bit more of an added functionality behind it and complexity, which I love about it. I think with that's one of the defining features between presence knobs on guitar amps. I think they have some of them
Yeah.
just do a really really good job at highlighting that portion. So I tend to, whenever I'm working with somebody who's using this guitar amp, I always tend to resort to using presence before I go to treble. Um,
Hmm.
you
That
know,
makes sense. Yeah.
I think in some ways too, I think the treble makes more sense for clean guitars. Presence and metal is a better combination. Um, you don't really need all this sort of high screechingness coming from the treble. That's not really that necessary. But when it's like a really clean guitar, and you have like those soft ballad in between moments or whatever,
Yeah.
those make a lot more sense because you have this sort of airiness to that clean, which you want to preserve.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And again, for me, it just depends on the amp I'm playing through. Like some amps sound good with a little presence added. And like I said, my treble usually stays the same, right, at 6.5, ish. And I don't know. Like I'm looking at, like I said, I'm looking at. You guys can't see it, but I'm looking at my EVH right now, and I'm thinking, man, I want to come play you, which I'm going to do after this show. But yeah, like I said, my settings as a guitar player are very, very modest. There's nothing crazy going on, even with the presence, and but I think it varies from amp to amp. I don't think that you can use the exact same settings on every amp, but I think you can use similar settings. Most amps. But again, the one thing that changes for me is that presence knob. Some amps just sound better with it cut a little bit. Some sound better with it boosted a little bit. Just depends on your flavor and style of music too. Of course, that could be a big thing as well.
Yeah. Is there like a specific like album that you really love bass for, or
Uh,
guitar? Do you have like an ultimate like, oh man, I love this album's tone?
You know what I like? I think one of my favorite tones, bass guitar and rhythm guitars, and this is not an album that's very popular. It's Megadeth's Endgame.
Endgame,
I
really,
love the tone on that album, dude. I love the bass tone on that. I love everything about that.
really.
Chris Broderick was their guitar player then.
Wow. I actually, yeah, I mean, I guess I never really listened to Endgame for the tone. Like, it wasn't my favorite Megadeth album, but
Yeah, yeah.
it
It's
was a good sounding album, that's for sure. I felt like Megadeth's production always kind of maintained really high standards. I mean,
yeah.
I still like the tones of Peace Cells when it comes to bass, man.
Oh yeah, I do. Now he carried that same tone into Euthanasia. What I liked about
Mm,
Megadeth's Euthanasia album is it was, to me, in my opinion, it was everything that Peace Sells was, but with better production and better guitar tones. That's just
yeah.
my opinion. But Dave Ellefson does some really cool bass stuff on that album. Uh, what was that one song? Now I can't remember the name of it, of course, but there's one song, "Let Me Show You How I Love You." Keep it in the family. Family Tree is what it was called. So there's the bass is carrying the verses, which I really like a lot, and it just sounds really awesome. And then the final track on that album, same thing. The verses, you hear the bass in there, jun,
Mm.
jun, dun, 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 and it just sounds amazing, dude. So I mean, as far as tones go, that's Megadeth really nailed it because it was funny. Like their earlier albums, they nailed it with the bass, but their guitar tones are very tinny. And of course, the production of drums and that sort of
Right,
thing wasn't the greatest back in those days. You know what I mean?
for
But now
sure.
those albums remastered, sound really great. So I think they had a lot of great things going for them. What's one of yours, dude, as far as bass guitar goes?
For as far as bass,
Yeah,
I'm trying to. Well, I mean, I did feel like Peace Cells was definitely one of them, but I
yeah,
feel
you mentioned that.
also trying to think. I really love Slayer, man. Slayer. It's like
Yeah,
Slayer has
they've got
got.
some cool stuff.
It's
Yeah,
like Tom Araya, man. Fucking laid that shit down. Like but I also just love. I think Tom Araya's vocals. I think the way how Slayer kind of conducted their bass parts wasn't necessarily very complicated. I think it was just more of a feeling of heaviness
yeah,
to add to
just
it. That's what they were really good at. And I just love Araya's vocals. So,
he's got some great vocals, dude. Yeah.
like this sort of like shouting, not even like screaming, but like shouting sort of type of vibe.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, like gets you so pumped. So, I think really like his parts really did emphasize on that. Of course, I think at the same time, Lombardo, his drumming just kind of took it to another level. So,
Yeah, yeah.
he played more of a supportive role, but it had a weight. But I'm trying to also think of what was an album, because I'm kind of debating, like does bass take a priority here, or like is there an album that you have in mind that maybe bass doesn't take that much of a priority?
Yeah, I would
That's an
say,
interesting way to kind of. That's an interesting
yeah,
thing too.
listening to bands like Arch Enemy and Amon Amarth, where it's clear the bass is really just playing that supportive role of the song, and then let's just take their latest albums like Arch Enemy's Will to Power and Amon Amarth's Berserker album, the latest ones. Now, go back to First Kill, Monza Marth, that album.
Yeah. Wow.
First Kill is the name. Yeah, that what Jones Viking. The first song on the album is called First Kill. I don't think that was meant to be a pun, but there's a little bass solo part in that song, and I'm like, dude, this is badass, when you see it starts and then it kind of slows down a little bit, and he's like, do 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 do, and it's just amazing, dude. It's like, okay, and then it's just the bass with Johan's vocals, the death metal vocals. I'm like, okay, this sounds awesome, and they allow it to build up, throwing in the guitars, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. So that's just a perfect example of how bass that plays just really a supporting role most of the time can be used to help build songs up and to shine through So it's
Yeah.
not just like full on all the time. Because even as much as I love metal and death metal and melodic death metal, sometimes I don't want to hear the same full on every single song for the entire song. It's like, okay, surprise me with something. You know what I mean? It's like do something a little different and surprise me.
Yeah.
This is kind of my beef with albums that kind of seem to sound the same and all run together. Yeah, I want the same sound, of course, it's the band sound, but throw a little surprise in there now and then.
Sometimes, yeah, I totally agree. I sometimes I do wish that some bands would take a little bit more liberty with the bass.
Hmm.
I find that a band like even like Winter Sun,
Oh
um,
yes, dude.
which Winter Sun is a phenomenal like Yari is a great composer. I think that's how you
Yeah,
say it. But he's a great composer, but I feel like he focuses more on the keys than he does with the
yeah,
actual bass lines. If you listen to Time One, that album, um, the bass is like playing exactly what the guitars are doing, just playing the fundamentals. So it's not really having too big of a role. Um, and I it's like for because I love that album to death. I listened to it like so many times, but
yeah.
it's when you think about it, it's like yeah, there could have been just a little more. You could have just like I mean, it's a complex
A
album
little
in and
bit, yeah.
of itself, but it's definitely highlighting um a different instrument set rather than the others. Like this one's a more keyboard heavy album versus other bands. Yeah, like I think Winter Sun probably comes from Finland, if I'm
I think
correct,
they're finished. Yeah,
right?
I think they're a finished
So
band.
that Northern European like
Yeah.
style music, there are some similarities, but I feel like with the Finnish, it's more definitely more melodic,
Yes. Finnish
and
and Swedish bands more melodic for
more
sure, dude.
melodic. And then when you
Insomnium,
get to
Winter
the
Sun,
Amon Amarth, the Norwegian stuff, that's a little bit more
Amorphous. Yeah.
dark and heavy. Although I love Amorphous, I think Amorphous has a great bass
Man.
line to go
Oh yeah, I
along with
was listening
them.
to their latest album for 2018 the other day, and they're amazing, dude. They're so amazing. I'll tell you who one of my favorite bass players. It's probably because it's one of my favorite bands, and this dude just looks cool. Like if I could look like anybody else, I mean, it'd probably be Ken as well, but I would look like Marco from Nightwish, and he's one of my favorite people in the whole world, favorite musicians, man. And
Yeah,
he's
for
got,
sure.
especially on one of the really hit songs, "I Want My Tears Back." Uh, he's just playing the bass line as the vocals are going, and dude, he just sounds phenomenal. Plus, the dude just looks cool, man. He's got this super long hair, long goatee, and this badass looking bass up there, and just, you know, that's one of my favorite bands. So I'm biased, you know what I mean. So everything they do, I love, except for this latest album. I'm not really too in love with that one, but aside from that, though, they just have such a cool. They have such a cult following almost. I guess I'm part of that cult now, but but he does have some really cool bass lines, and that's an example of of course they're a Finnish band as well. That's another example of a band that's very well orchestrated. They have a lot of keys and orchestration as well, but they're very good at everything having its own place. When we're listening to like extreme death metal, okay, it's full on guitars and double bass drumming and screeching vocals, and that's fine. But when you want to listen to something that's just really well orchestrated from every front, I think Nightwish, they are it, and there are a lot of bands that are kind of like them, like After Forever, Within Temptation, those bands. But we're talking about European metal here, man. I love it, dude. I
European metal
eat
is
that
great.
stuff up.
Not to take away from anything that's happened to you. You have bands in America like Pantera that are amazing too in Southern rock.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's just such an array of like colors around this. It
Yeah.
really, I think, the premise of where it's being used heavily affects how it's written. And it's just context. Like any argument that you ever have with somebody, if you've never got the context, you probably don't even know what the fight's all about. So,
That's true, dude.
so
Yeah.
you gotta you put it into context and where it fits. And some genres of
Yeah.
metal utilize um, melodic bass more so than other ones, and there's a good reason for
Yeah.
that.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely, dude.
but Jason, this was like such a chock full of like awesome content here. I'm loving
Yeah,
this.
this is good
We
stuff,
could
dude.
talk about this for hours.
Yeah, we could go on about this all day because I mean, tones, guitar and bass tones, that there's something they are very subjective. And like I may come up with a tone that I love even in the mix, but some other people might not like it so much, and that's
Right.
okay. We have to get to the point where we're okay with that. However, there's a difference between having a subjective tone in the mix that you like or dislike. There's a difference between that and having a tone that works in the mix. So if you're listening to something even with a great tone, if it's making the mix muddy and you can't hear the notes being distinguished and pronounced, and it's taken away from the frequencies are competing, you can tell that, then that's the wrong thing to do, right?
Yeah, that's
uh,
yeah, that's where I always am a big fan of using the DI for recording sessions, because you don't know
yeah.
if the tone that you're recording with is the right tone, and you wouldn't necessarily want to replay the entire track. You just want to change the tone.
I'm
And
struggling with that, by the way, just so you know. I'm struggling with
yeah,
that.
that's why you got to get a DI box, man. DI
Yeah.
boxes are really really good for that, because then you can record your
Yeah.
guitar amp separately from the guitar itself, and
I guess a
priceless.
good thing, like this album I'm working on right now, I've already recorded all the guitar tracks with plugins. So I've technically got that,
Yeah.
I can just remove the plugin from that track. So I'm good. And actually I like the tone with the Positive Grid plugin I use. I'm like, do I really need to record this with a real amp? Because now I'm going to be trying to not match that tone, but to get something that sounds as good, because it sounds really good. I don't like to be a fanboy of electronic products, but I really love their Bias Amp 2 and Bias FX, how those work together. It's just, I've used so many plugins, and there's some good ones, some great ones out there, but I just have not been able to replicate what I have with Bias products. But that being said, I want to record the rhythm track, so I probably won't do the DI since I already have the signal, in there. But I'm really wanting that raw amp tone for this thing. I am going to replace the cab, Ken. I know we talked about cabinets. I've got a 212 with the EVH, but do you think I need a 412 to get that effect, to get that big push effect?
212 does definitely a lot of work. You have two 12-inch
Yeah,
woofers pushing a lot of air in your space. It's
probably don't
the
need the
smaller the
4.
space, the easier it is to get away with a smaller cab.
Yeah.
It really is,
Okay. Okay.
because it fits within the confines. It's like I would never, in a 10 by 10 room, get
Mm.
giant floor standing speakers to mix on, because
Right.
there's not enough air in the room for it to move the way it needs to. So if you have a smaller space, a smaller cabinet works for that. That's why they're designed for that. But if you're playing a show, a 4x4 is really necessary, because it really moves a lot more air, and that's
A lot of air.
what you're
Yeah.
trying to do. So again, context, right? Where you're using it is
Yeah.
important,
Right.
and the environment, and it should match. They should make sense. So I don't think you necessarily need to change your cabinet. I mean, unless
Hmm.
that's what you want to do, by all means, do it. But
Yeah.
it's not necessary.
There's not a okay. That's good to know. Yeah, 10 by 11 room here. I've got. It's funny. It's in the room like I'm in. I know we're kind of going off the beaten path, but this is fun stuff, and we still got some people on. But this is an untreated room. I take that back though. I've actually got a curtain in front of the closet doors over here that absorbs some things, and I've got a chair behind me over there, or in front of me rather, that kind of helps absorb in a small room. And I've got a blackout curtain over here, so I do have some treatment. I can't say it's completely untreated, but it sounds, I don't know, I'm able to mix in here quite well. I'm afraid to change anything because I have a feeling that will screw things up for me.
Well,
Now
you
when I move
definitely will
into the
have to
bigger studio
learn.
room,
You
different.
have to
Yeah.
relearn your speakers.
Right, right. Yeah, I guess I'm just not willing to do that in this room. You and I talked. I've got a bigger room in the house that I'm going to close off. That's like a loft area. So whenever I do that project, yeah, I'm going to have to relearn the speakers, and that's a much larger room, probably 3 times the size. And I'll probably have to upgrade my speakers from like 5 inch to 8 inch or something like that. And
Yeah.
you and I will be talking more because I'm going to lean on you for a lot of guidance when it comes to that, and then we'll be sharing that on here with you guys as well when it
Well,
comes to
yeah.
that.
I
So
mean, why not? That's why
yeah,
we're here, right? So,
yeah, to help you guys. Yeah,
this was awesome, guys. So, guys, if you haven't already checked out metalmastermind.com. Dude, there's like so much cool content on there. We've got
There's
blogs,
a lot, dude.
lot of
Yes.
blogs, man. Like, check them out, read them, and give us your comments in those blogs posts, because they really do help give us feedback as to what we like to write about for our audience, or what our audience wants to hear from us. So we want that opinion. And if you're new here today, there is a PDF that you get for free from signing up to our email list at metalmastermind.com/join. It'll give you like a free, quick guide to the ultimate home studio to learn how to build your setup from start to finish, and as quick of a read as possible. So you get all the information that you really need, and you can kind of do with that with what you will. That being said, Jason, you have any other last words to give our audience?
No, other than the fact that, guys, we are, Ken and I have been putting in a lot of work behind the scenes on this project. I know our audience, we appreciate you guys joining these live views. I know sometimes live YouTubes on a small channel like ours we don't really get the audience, but I just want you guys to know we're not really, yeah, we want to grow, of course, but we're not really looking to reach millions of people. We are very much centered around the metal musician, and that's a small group of us. So, we want to grow the live stream. Would like to see more people come on. So if you don't mind sharing, like sharing the links we send out in the email. I know we sent out an email today, reminder, and we sent one yesterday as well. And just please share that with your musician friends. Say, hey, man, we're part of this family of metal musicians here. And if you're in a band, definitely share this with your bandmates if they can join. You know what I mean? So do that, please. That would help. We want to reach as many metal musicians as possible. I know this is always going to be kind of a more compact group again because it's metal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of metal. But and also to add to that, yeah, we've put out a buttload of content lately, man, blog posts, and we've got other videos on YouTube. So after we sign off here, go to that link that I sent just a minute ago, the blogs, and just go through there. There's probably like 10 or 12 posts on there. And then feel free to go back to our YouTube channel. Ken just put out a uh comprehensive review of a specific tape machine plugin. That's like a 30-minute long
Actually,
tutorial in
4 tape
comparison.
machines.
Oh, dude.
It's four
Wow.
tape
So
machines.
yeah, it's crazy. That's a crazy. I mean, Ken's just been working with this specific plugin from Antelope, and so if you you're going to learn a lot from those tutorials that he puts out. I know we've got some other videos we put out together. I think I put a amp
Yeah,
sim out
you
there.
definitely. Jason's been putting out a lot of like amp simulators. So being the guitarist that he is the guy to go to for that kind of stuff. If you want to check out any like mix tips and stuff like that, watch the videos that I put out. There's gonna have a lot of different plugins
Dude.
in relation to how to mix with this kind of stuff. So we got a lot of content coming out each week. We're trying to build even more content for you guys. We feel like giving this stuff out there is what you guys need or want. And if there's something that you guys don't agree with, we want to hear from you, right? We're trying to serve
Absolutely.
you. We're trying to serve you. So if you want to hear something from us, we treasure your opinions in this situation. So please let us know. Write your thoughts in the comments section below. Every time we go live, we always try to answer the comments that come up because we value your membership here at Metal Mastermind, and we do view you like as family, like members of this family, because we're metalheads, we're brothers, we're sisters. We've always thought that way, even in the mosh pit. So we're trying to help our own brethren and sisters out there in order to create a better world for metal musicians, because that's who we are, and that's what we identify with. So, horns up, everybody. This is Metal Mastermind, okay? We'll see you all
Yes, it is.
next time. Take
Same
care
time.
and stay metal.
Stay metal, guys.